If you want to see how you can double or more the profit in your agency without adding any clients, then this is the video for you. In this video, I'll show you how I've taken agencies, including my own, from 10% or less margins to 35% or more in under 30 days by slicing profits in multiple ways. Now, a disclaimer here. If you run this process correctly, you could end up with margins of 40% or even more, and actually, there's a big risk in doing that. So stay to the end and make sure you watch, because I'll reveal to you why that might be a mistake. You want your margins to be really good, really healthy, but not too big, and I'll get to that at the end. So in the 4th year of running my agency, I really had a knot in my stomach from stress. We were getting clients, we were keeping clients, but my profit margins, they weren't that great. In fact, in some months, I'd actually go negative. So I thought I'd been being careful. I'd been scoping each engagement really careful. Somehow that just wasn't enough. It was really the weirdest thing. On paper, I should be making money, but based on the retainer we were getting and the cost to my staff, it really looked like I should be making money. But some months I'd actually go negative, and it was just completely frustrating. So what was going on? Now, I'm going to show you how I figured it out and the method that I now use to help agency owners fix their margins to double profitability, even if they don't get any more clients. In just the next 10 minutes, you'll have a 7-step blueprint. And at the end of this video, I'll give you 2 critical pieces. Number 1, as I mentioned, the surprising reason why you don't want your margins to be too big. And secondly, a way to implement all of this in just 30 days, even if it seems overwhelming to you. So stick with me, because some of this stuff, if you're not a numbers person, might seem a little overwhelming, but I'm going to simplify it all, tie it in a bow towards the end. So stick with me. Before we jump in, there's actually one secret that nobody has told you about margins. And that is that the blended profitability of your agency is only somewhat relevant until the business gets to scale. And what do I mean by blended profitability? If you're saying that your profit margin is, let's say, 15% for the whole agency, that's kind of a nice number to know, but here's the problem, and here's the secret. That's not actually actionable. You can't do anything with that number. So that's why I was tearing my hair out, and I was just kind of depressed about it after learning, oh, my margins, they're terrible this month. What am I going to do? That's because I was just looking at that blended margin number. That's why I felt trapped. And I thought the number was fine. It should look fine on paper, but things weren't working. So the first discovery that I made, and the first thing that I'm sharing with you, is that the real gains in your margins are made by slicing the numbers and doubling down on what works and cutting out what does not work. So this is really important. Don't just look at overall profit and your overall margins. You need to look at 7 different profitability numbers that I'm going to give you. And if you don't do this, you're going to be spending your time and your energy on things that are actually making you less revenue. Now, let's get right in. Here are the 7 things to analyze. And as a shameless plug, as an aside, if this seems hard, I can help you do this if you work with me. But end shameless plug. Let's jump in. The first number is profitability by client. So some of your agency clients are killing your business. That's because you might not have looked at the profitability on a per client basis. You have to understand what the margins are for each individual client. And what you'll probably do if you do that analysis is you're going to find clients that are actually losing you money. In other words, you're paying them money essentially, or you're paying money out of your pocket and you're not getting enough back. So what you need to do is figure out what the economics are for each individual client and decide, are you going to have to adjust the margins, fire some clients, double down on certain clients? You want to identify the profitable clients and find out how to keep those folks delighted, and then repeat it with other clients. As you're going forward, I had to learn this the hard way, only sign new clients that meet the profile of this kind of client that's super profitable. So what I did when I was running my agency, I looked at it and I found out, oh man, I'm making like a 3% margin on some of these clients, but that can quickly turn upside down. And in some months that was happening to a huge degree because the client was excessively demanding in one month and a little bit less. And maybe it looked like it should be 3%, but actually it was negative 10%. And cutting out those clients and doubling down on the ones that were 20+% made a huge difference very quickly in my overall profitability. So that was number 2. Now we look at number 2, profitability by service line. If you're like most agencies, you've probably added on service lines, but you might not realize that some of them are killing your profits. You might be only, again, measuring profitability on the whole whole business, or maybe even by client, but not by service line. Each service line, each thing that you do for a client has its own margin. So you could be making a ton of profit with one service and losing on others, but not realize it because it's all blended into one scope, or you might have scoped it individually, but you're not tracking it individually. So what I did in my agency was I teased these out and looked at each service line separately. And I made sure my bids and my scopes were appropriate for each one of those. And then I tracked it individually. So if we were doing, for example, in my agency's case, we would do blogging would be one thing, podcast, video marketing, and each one I had to look at the profitability independently, because if you just look blended as a client, it can hide the fact that some are more profitable than others. And you can be leaking profit in some areas and not knowing that you're tremendously profitable in others. So that's number 2. Number 3, profitability by team member. Now, you might hate to hear this, but it's real. You might have agency employees who are losing you money. Now, the fact is, some team members are more profitable than others. They might be great people, all of them, but sometimes employees aren't as profitable as other employees. And which ones are profitable actually might depend on if you're billing hourly, you're billing fixed fee, you're billing retainer. For example, a slow and methodical but highly accurate team member might do great on hourly because they can be slow and take their time, but they can kill your margin on a fixed fee because they're eating up the clock against a fixed fee type of retainer. So when you start to look by each individual employee and then line that up against how you are charging the client, you can understand how to staff people for their unique skills against the kind of billing you're doing for the client. And if you're doing one kind of billing for a client, you might have to reconsider what kind of staff skills you need and how they approach it in order to be the most profitable. Number 4, profitability over time. Did you ever have a month where your profits were really, really thin and you had no idea why? I know I did. I told you about that. Many engagements vary in margin over time. For example, in my agency, there was a ton of upfront work. So margins were really low at the beginning. Then they got high during ongoing delivery. So we'd start out with a whole bunch of work we had to do, and our margins were really pretty bad at the beginning, but we made up for it in the long term. Now, over time, we want to have a long-term relationship. So we'd capture a lot of profit from each one of those engagements, but it was really front heavy. So in almost every agency I see, the profitability is pretty lumpy, right? It's not all the same. It's not all smooth. And expenses, that's the other thing, can be lumpy too. Let's say you've got certain contractors, certain expenses in your business. Those can be lumpy too. The issue with that is that all of these lumpy things combine, and then you might get collections that are lumpy. So you might have a lot of expenses and not a lot of profits, and then your collections might be pushed out a little bit, and all of a sudden you're in a cash crunch. It's important to understand when all of these lumpy areas are going to converge, because otherwise you can't plan, you can't resource engagements, and you could hit this convergence where a bunch of low margin work happens at once, and then you're potentially stretched on your collections, and then you've got a bunch of expenses. All those things could hit. So understanding how each engagement flows in terms of where the work pockets are will not only help you resource better, but will help you understand what the margins are going to be over time. And if you look down the road as you're planning on growing the business, if you don't really get this at a fundamental level, it's going to do 2 things. It's going to, number 1, constrain your growth because you'll always be in feast or famine mode. And number 2, if you ever wanted to have the option to sell your agency, they're going to be asking hard questions about why cash was thin at certain points. And if you can't answer that well, you're going to take a beating on your valuation. So it's really important to understand this. So number 5, profitability by season. I don't know if you've ever noticed how people shop a little bit differently during the holidays. They act differently during the summer. Nearly every business has seasonality, even if it isn't obvious. And this applies to agencies too. It could have to do with selling season. So for instance, in my agency, we never got any clients in the late summer. It just seemed like the whole world shut down, and we could year to year know we're not getting any clients if we don't have any by July. No one's going to wake up again until September. So we had to time our push in terms of customer acquisition, of client acquisition into September, October. Then everything went quiet again in November as people were getting ready for Thanksgiving. And then a little bit happened, then nothing for the holidays. And then it was crickets until mid-January. So we had to time our client acquisition. And then we had to time how we're going to onboard those clients because there was more upfront work. But understanding this let us do it much better and let us allocate our resources appropriately. There also are usage seasons when clients might be launching campaigns. You'd probably be very aware of this if you're doing something with D2C businesses where they're launching a bunch of holiday promos and things like that. So what you need to do in this circumstance is look over the prior years and find out if certain seasons had a different profitability and a different client acquisition profiles, and make sure to manage your cash accordingly, because you can actually, again, get in a cash crunch if you're not watching this, or you could have a number of clients churning out but nothing to replace them with. So understanding this is really going to help margins. Number 6, profitability by market segment. So I started my agency not the smartest way. I started with the cheapest, lowest margin segment of the market possible. And I'll tell you, it sucked. Until I started to raise retainers, I didn't even realize how much it sucked. So it'll be the same for most agencies. Some segments of your client base or your prospective client base will be more profitable than others. Now, it could be large versus small clients. It could be certain geographies. It could even be certain psychographics of the buyer, who they are. But if you think every market segment is the same, and again, you're kind of lumping it all together in one blended profitability, one blended margin of the agency, it means that you just haven't analyzed it. It means that you're missing out on understanding where to drill for these oil wells of profit. Because in my case, I found out I couldn't go super huge, right? I couldn't go to the biggest of the big enterprise sales style of clients, but also the little guys, they churned out fast and they were really low margin. So there was a sweet spot for me of a certain size of client that was more profitable than the others. I actually segmented it into 5 different strata of clients. And I found that the one that was like the second from the bottom was actually the most profitable, but they churned out faster. The third one from the bottom was not quite as profitable, but they stayed longer. And I could make those decisions because I'd done a margin analysis on each one. Now, number 7 is profitability by fee level. So this is an interesting one because higher total fees don't always mean better margins. So if you're charging more, you aren't always getting better margins. Sometimes big clients can actually squeeze your margins. I don't know if you've ever had a big client and they're just putting the screws to you on what the retainer is. I've seen a lot of agencies that would actually be better off firing a client that is 50% of total revenue because the margins were so bad that that would actually give the agency the room to get a whole bunch more clients that were profitable. So you've just heard 7 things to analyze. And yes, this is a pain in the butt, but it will also make you a ton of money. Do you know how important I think this is? So much so that it is one of the first things that I do with clients because I can double margins in just 30 days of understanding what's going on. So at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that there is a risk if your margins get over 40%. And this is a really interesting thing that I learned. You want good margins, and that's why you do this. That's why you go through the process that I walked through in this video. But if your margins are way too good with one client, I want you to ask yourself this question: am I delivering enough value? Because if the margins are too good, the client might realize they can hire in-house or find another agency. So the secret here is not just good margins for you, but a long-term relationship with the client. So you get paid for a long time. Because what it might seem is like you look at it and say, wow, I've got 60% margins on this client. That sounds great, but it's not so great if that client churns out. So you can also think about margins as too low is one alarm bell. Maybe not an alarm bell, but it's something you need to take a look at. Am I delivering enough value? Can I deliver more value that will keep the client for longer? So you find your sweet spot. In my case, it was around a 30% margin was my sweet spot. But for some, it might be 40. For some, it might be 20. But no matter what, if you're under 10, danger zone. But find out what your sweet spot is. Lastly, I get it. This seems hard. It's easier to just keep on doing what you're doing instead of doing this analysis. But if you really want to double margins, either take the time to do this yourself. That's right. Open up your calendar, schedule it, or work with someone who's done it to guide you through it. You will not regret it.